uh, when the AU decided to appoint an audit report of its activities under the leadership of former President Obasanjo of Nigeria. And Obasanjo came up in 2006 and formed a committee of eminent Africans to review the African Union. And this was almost 4 years into its formation. And that report was released in 2006. It's called the AU Audit Report, AU Audit Committee Report, otherwise simply called the Obasanjo Report. And what that report did was to make a number of recommendations about where the OAU was going. One of them has already been mentioned by Anita, which is the AU needs to prioritize its objectives and its mandates. Its missions have to be prioritized. It is doing too much with too few resources. It's too overstretched. So let's get our priorities clear. The second one was 4 years down the road. Obasanjo report said, this is not an African Union of the people, because the people are absent. You remember that the Constitutive Act of 2002 talked about the union of the African peoples. And the audit report of 2006 is saying, no, that's not correct. We need to do more in making sure that this is a union of the African people. That means bringing more Africans, more voices around the African Union. The third recommendation, and is actually critical, is that the AU need to self-finance itself. We cannot, as an institution that represents the African people, be dependent on external donors. And that's what that report said. How can we do more to finance our activities, our union? What I like about that audit report is that it also recommended that there should be periodic, 5-year periodic internal reports by the AU on where it's going. That means from 2006, they recommended by 2012, we need another audit report, but it should be actually an internal report. We don't need a report by heads of state or eminent persons. The AU can self-police itself and provide an audit of what it's doing. It is not surprising, therefore, that by 2016, the AU comes up again and says, no, we need another report to talk about AU reforms. And this is what is now famously called the Kagame Report, which was mandated by the AU in 2016 and released in 2017, January. Interestingly, if you look at the Kagame Report and compare that report to the Obasanjo report, they're almost the same. The issues that Obasanjo raised in 2006 are the same issues that the Obasanjo report raises. Sorry, the Kagame report raises. No dependence on external actors. We don't have citizens in place. We need to prioritize. We need a lean and mean commission. These are all things that Kagame is recommending in 2017. So I think that history provides us the context. But let me say a final thing before I stop here. So what happened with the Kagame report is that the AU established a reform unit within the commission. It's headed by two people, Professor Mukoko from Cameroon and a Kenyan friend of mine, Shiru Maura. I worked with her in 2003 on Northern Kenya when she was working with Oxfam. So these are the people now who are driving reform from within the AU. And I think when we look at some of the progress or the problems of the Kagame reforms, we'll see these are the people really at the core of that process. But what happened last year after Kagame presented his report, the AU now said, oh, let's appoint another champion of reform. And they appointed Mr. William Ruto from Kenya, who is now the champion of AU reform. So anyway, let me stop there and then we can get back to other issues. But I wanted to give that background to say that this process has been mandated by the Africans because this is our union. And therefore, we should be interested in what is happening. And we should be critical of what is happening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. I mean, I was hearing issues of, commitment, if we say that we have two similar reports, but perhaps issues of implementation as well would be a problem. I would like to invite Dr. Wekesa. And as you come in, Doc, I also want you to just start us off on the future of the AU's external relations in terms of financial autonomy and the external influence, because this has just previously been highlighted. We've heard that the AU remains largely dependent on external donors for funding. And of course, this raises concerns about the ability to act independently. So I would also like you to just briefly comment on some realistic steps in your view that can be taken to achieve financial self-sufficiency. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kabaso. I think we couldn't have had a better person to, recap the historical arc of the African Union. But I think bringing it fast forward to pretty much the present, I think one of the major shortcomings of the AU is credibility trust gap. It's actually a crisis of credibility in the sense that we currently on the continent face so many crises. There are just so many that one wonders where to start. Just today, we are learning that the M23 actually executed or killed the governor of North Kivu in Eastern DRC. Now, if you look at the institutional structure of the African Union, we have something known as the Peace and Security Council. This will be the entity that will have been responsible for pacifying the continued cross-border and internal strife in the DRC. It has not risen to the occasion, and this is now where we are in terms of the escalation, in what is essentially a war zone there. If you look at the Sudan itself, reports indicate, initially as of last week, we had reports indicating that 26,000 people had been killed. Today, we are learning that the number is actually 60,000, and that is still a conservative estimate. So essentially, we are looking at a Sudan that is rapidly becoming a failed state, as we saw with Somalia, which is trying to get back on its feet, but with baby steps. So in the face of this, without going to climate change, which Anita indicated, with economic underdevelopment and the rising poverty, because Africans are increasingly more poor than they were, say, a decade or 2 decades ago. If we went on to deficits in the infrastructure space and so forth, we do then realize that the continent is retrogressing and the African Union is to blame, as it were. Having said that, in terms of some of the practical steps, particularly where external powers are concerned, we have yet another crisis there, because the Chinese, the Europeans, the Indians, the Russians are all encircling the continent, coming with their own agendas. I invite you to just look at the number of summits that are lined up this year alone. All of them that come with partnership agreements, action plans, and so forth. And look at the input of the AU. Last year, we had the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. And if you look at the text of the action plan and the declaration, it doesn't read anywhere close to what the AU will have wished for. Instead, it is filled with agendas to do with the Belt and Road Initiative and so forth. If you look at the Russia-Africa Summit of 2023, and you look at the action plan, it will talk more of Russian interests, the AU, Africa, the same. And so I think the citizenry, particularly the citizens who are well-educated, middle class, and so forth, who are conversant with these issues, look at the AU and they just kind of give up because where the AU is supposed to project, protect, and promote African interests, they actually take a backseat and say, what are we getting from out there? So I'll say that the major problem with the AU is internal structural deficiencies that are reflected in its relations with global powers, which are greatly asymmetrical, greatly skewed in the disfavor of the continent. And I think if one looks at, we start with the crisis and then we move a bit backwards. The crisis take us back to the organizational capacity, the institutional structure of the African Union, which doesn't seem to be fit for purpose. There have been quite a number of stories and articles and news and information indicating that many of the senior positions in the various departments and units at the African Union are actually dished out on the basis of cronyism, whereas those of us here who are scholars will have actually done well as perhaps people fitting in those positions. And so I think these shortcomings, the starting point is the structural deficiencies. One can also mention the fact that we lack a mechanism, the will, the political will to enforce our resolutions. And particularly this then brings in the heads of state, the old adage that the African Union is a club of African strongmen hasn't quite been done away with, even from the transition from the OAU to the AU. From the period when Thabo Mbeki, for example, was talking of the African Renaissance, I think we are still stuck with the African strongmen, and we have them including in the East African region and so forth. Dr. Kabwe, I think I'll stop here so that you give an opportunity to my colleagues to speak. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to invite Dr. Anita, and as you come in, I'd like you first of all to just comment on two things. One is, while we are still discussing financial autonomy and picking up from where the doc left it, what role would you say member states should play in this, in ensuring that we achieve the financial autonomy that we want, as well as the private sector in the various member countries? What is the role of the private sector and member states? And then, since Dr. Wekesa mentioned the leadership of the AU, we have the AU chairperson, deputy, and commissioner elections coming up next month. How might the leadership transition impact the AU's reform agenda, particularly in shaping external partnerships and strengthening Africa's agency? So I would like you to also comment on what qualities you think the next leadership should prioritize to drive this, the institutional reforms that we're talking about and ensuring strategic engagement. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you once again, Kabaso. I think I'll start off with the last question that you've asked with regards to the political transition in terms of the new leadership and what they need to prioritize. I believe that the speakers before have already talked about where we've come from as Africa and what we need to do, but maybe just to re-emphasize the areas that we need now to put more emphasis on is that we still need to go back to the reform agenda because we haven't really come out, quite clearly whether we have been able to reform, financially speaking, the governance structures, the prioritization and timelines, and so on. So it is more or less a cascading of what has been done before, with a bit more emphasis before we seek ways to have additional priorities. So maybe just to let you know what those two major priorities are from the 2017 report from President Kagame. One of the reforms was basically Agenda 2063. We know that it's still far, with regards to this is 2025 and we've got 2063 to go to. But within 2063 and what we expected to do before then is to ensure that we have peace and stability in Africa. This is something that we've tried as much as we can with regards to our level best as nations, as sub-regional organizations, and the entire region in terms of how we can, move towards to have peace and stability in the region. So that is still one of those priorities. The other one is to have a united Africa. Of course, there was a clarion call when we see the emergence of the Organization of African Unity. So we still need to go back to try to find out what is that we sought to unify Africa and Africans as one. So in as much as now we've moved years, well before or in advance, we still need to go and find out what is it that the forefathers, one would say, were thinking of at that point in time. Then what is that Africans sought to, come around in order to, say that we are unifying against certain purposes or certain objectives or certain strategies. So there's need for that. Again, of course, this has got everything to do with Pan-Africanism and what we expect as Africans within the larger context of Pan-Africanism. The other priority, which has been there at the national level and also at the regional level, is to end poverty. We've had various, national strategies to end poverty, but it has never really gone beyond what we expected it to do in terms of our nations and so on. We've also tried using the, Millennium Development Goals and, Sustainable Development Goals to see how we can achieve less poverty in Africa. So for this, I would see a situation whereby we still go back to the SDGs to try to complement the policies and priorities that we have as Africa currently. Other priorities that we see from 2017, which have been, rather slow in coming, is to have an African passport. Of course, the idea here was to ensure that Africans are able to move from one place to another visa-free. We have achieved that to some extent because some of our nations are visa-free, but would like a situation whereby the entire region is actually visa-free and Africans are able to move so that we can actually actualize the African Continental Free Trade Area as envisioned in the reports that have been there before. We've also thought about a single air transport. We know how difficult it is to move, from one country to another in Africa. And we more or less stopped at some point in time, probably 1.5 years ago, when we started negotiating with the international agency that is, of course, associated with how we are able to move, in the airspace that Africa dominates. So we still need to get back as Africans to see how we can have that single air transport. The only thing that I'm seeing here, of course, is BRI or Belt and Road Initiative from China coming to make things a bit more easier by ensuring that we have trains that are moving from one place to another and a bit of infrastructural development, but less about the air transportation. So that still remains a priority in terms of moving from place to place. The other priority that has always been there since the OAU times is to end conflict. I know it sounds rather specific when you talk about ending conflict because some of us are, we come from schools of thought whereby conflict can never be ended, but it can be resolved. So we know how we can move towards resolving conflict, rather than saying that this is an end of all conflicts in Africa, which may not be a possibility as such. So we need, again, to go back to the eminent persons to come up with timelines with regards to how we are able to manage the various types of conflict that we have and have the necessary skills to manage that conflict or manage the dispute, because of course we've got distinctions, whether it's a conflict or whether it is a dispute. Prof. Alia talked about financial independence. So where are we going? Even as we have a new chairperson coming in, the idea then would to stop, relying heavily on external partners, in as much as SDG and MDG before had told us that we can work around with our partners to see how we can best resolve our own issues. We still know that that in Africa, we've said that it is possible for us to have at least a percentage provided by each and every nation to go into a kitty that would sustain some of the issues and priorities that we need to engage in. It may be not too much, but of course, that's a start. We know that probably less than 40% of the African nations actually subscribe to that kitty. So there's need for us to have enforcement mechanisms to see how we can best work around that. The other issue, of course, which has been ongoing that needs to really be fulfilled is to connect with Africans around Africa and beyond Africa. I'm talking about the diaspora and those of us who are in Africa. How do we reconnect with the citizens? To a large extent, we have moved in a right direction by, of course, reconnecting with our diaspora, but not in entirety. But there's also need for us, back home here in Africa to see how we can reconnect each other so that we are moving in the same direction as was hoped. So that to me would be, some of the major priorities that the new chairperson has to continually come up with, in as much as we still have newer issues emerging, as it were. Your question with regards to financing, I do not want to lay heavy burden to the diaspora who have really been coming through when it comes to providing, financial reprieve or fiscal reprieve to those of us in Africa. Beyond that, we should still, as those of us in Africa, see how best we can have fiscal prudence, fiscal not only representation, but also responsibility on what is expected of us and how we are moving towards the same direction, whether it is connecting citizens within Africa, coming up with a continental free trade area that has not really taken off as would have expected. Because if it took off, then we would have seen common markets coming up. And with that, then definitely there would be a bit more money moving from place to place, which can be a certain percentage can be taken up by the AU. So I think there's need for us to have that fiscal responsibility and prudence, and also ensure that beyond that, that we are accountable. Because at times in Africa, we want to look at what is happening around the world. At times, we even want to look at the European Union and try to see how is it that they are able to do it. How is it that the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe are able to get money about a certain program? So I think it would be best for us to also look around, not really to go there and benchmark, but of course, having the minds that we have here to see how best we can put our heads together and see us have a percentage through, of course, the resources that we have and also the importation and exportation that we have, to better see how then we can have our finances basically be home, bred, rather than always run into, external parties who already have their own interests. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kiamba. Prof, I would like you to just pick up from where Dr. Kiamba has left off, and you as well may comment on the leadership. Since this is an academic space, we're also allowed to perhaps critique the current leadership and be hopeful for what the next leadership may bring. And as you do that, I would also like you to comment on how the AU, with the incoming leadership, hopefully can move from a quantity-driven approach to a quality-focused strategy with the different external partners. We have heard that there's the Chinese now, we have even countries like Indonesia, Korea, and all these that are courting Africa. So just your comment on how the AU should strategize with these external engagements.
Quickly on the issue of external funding, on funding. There are two issues here. I think the AU is doing fairly well on the operational budget. And this is usually the contentious issue. Member states paying their dues every year to fund the operational budget. And over the years, I think we've seen an improvement, although there are still some countries don't really want to pay. But the only way to get them to pay is to shame and sanction them. And this hasn't been actually done. And it should be encouraged, because there's no reason why you want to be a member of the organization and you can't pay. So if the AU can be more serious on that issue, I think we will deal with that problem of who funds the operational budget. As I said, the good news is that most of the member states are paying their dues, and therefore there's no problem with the operational budget. The problem is with the program budget, which is still very much funded by donors, 85%. It is difficult to get member states to pay for programs at the AU, because this is a bigger fundamental issue. Most people really don't understand what the AU does. So if you ask them then to begin to pay extra money for programs at the AU, you have to be very careful how you explain what the AU does. And that is linked to the larger question of the AU does not explain itself better to the African population what exactly it is supposed to do or what it is doing. And this is not a question that you can resolve by so-called reform. This is a bigger problem of fundamentally re-engineering that institution. If the AU is too distant, if the AU is too far away from African people, how are you going to convince them to pay for programs? So that's how that issue can be resolved. Yeah, but I also want to respond to Bob's question about the DRC. The Kagame report said we need more money for the Peace Fund, because the Peace Fund is the fund that is going to fund conflict-related issues. And when Kagame reported last year, he said, you know, we've done very well on the Peace Fund. 96% of the anticipated funding of the Peace Fund is in place. We only have 4% left. And what he meant was, currently the Peace Fund, at least not currently, last year, the Peace Fund had 400 million, which, I mean, they anticipate additional money, but at least he said it was a good number. And then of that 400 million, 22% was allocated to something called the Crisis Reserve Facility. The Crisis Reserve Facility is the one now that divvies out money in conflict areas. In fact, what they did before last year, last year and before, they gave 2.2 million to the East African force in the DRC that was trying to keep peace in that very region, North Kivu. So the East African Standby Force was given 2.2 million for that operation. But of course, you know that the East African Peace or Support Operation was kicked out of that region by Mr. Tshisekedi. So it's no longer there. Now we have a SADC mission. I don't know how much SADC mission has been given to keep peace in that region, if the SADC mission can ever do it. So I'm reporting that there is at least some progress. There is some money from within Africa for peace operations, even though the the UN has promised to give more funding to African peace support operations. But there is something being done. Not sufficient, not enough. On the question of leadership, let me say a few things here. One, we've had very poor leadership in Africa across the board since the Renaissance Club of Mbeki, of Obasanjo, of Bouteflika left. So since then, we've been struggling really to have very strong leadership of the AU. And if you look at the Kagame report, it says it's not really the work of the Commission to reform itself. It's the work of the African leadership. And he argues in that report that what is lacking in Africa around leadership is a question of political will. So we have good ideas on paper. We have so many protocols, but he says there's no leadership around these protocols. How are we going to implement what heads of states are passing every year? And that is the biggest deficit. So leadership is a problem when it comes broadly to Africa. The second issue I want to make is that next year we anticipate there will be a new African Union chairperson, the AUC Commission chairperson. And the leading candidates is the Djibouti candidate, and then of course there is a Kenyan candidate. There are big issues about those two leaders if they ever emerge as the leaders of the AUC. But let me just talk a little bit about the Djibouti candidate, who I understand is the leader. And Djibouti is one of the most compromised countries on the continent. It has all the foreign forces you would ever think about, from the Koreans to the Americans to the French to the Japanese. So it's the less independent African state. So I would never imagine that somebody would propose a Djiboutian to be the head of the AU Commission, given the kind of country we are talking about. So we are off on a very bad start. If we can get somebody from Chad, Mr. Faki is from Chad, and then from Chad now, next year we have a leader from Djibouti. It's a problem. So I don't know what is really going to happen around the AU chairship. I don't know, AU Commission chairship. But I'm saying that we need a kind of leadership because we are headed into really big problems. And we need an AU that is steady and steady in its leadership. And therefore, we probably need to rethink the kinds of candidates we put up by member states. The issue of external partnership, Bob touched on it. And I think the story around external partnerships is we agreed, or the AU agreed, that there should be more coordination of efforts when we come to dealing with external partners, because these partners are increasing. But as they increase, there's no really coherent African voice towards the external world. And so the Kagame report suggested that we have, in fact, coordination around the AU being the leader like it's doing at the G20. So we have a very coordinated leadership from the AUC, and then maybe a few leaders of the RECs to go to these big meetings. But of course, we know that is not what is happening because we still want, all our countries still want to go to Beijing for the FOCAC summit. If Trump calls a summit in Washington of Africans, all of us will want to go, really defying what we are talking about in the kind of reform process. We need to be organized, we need to be strategic as we deal with external partners. We need a strategy on external partners. We don't have that strategy. In fact, almost most of our member countries don't have any strategies on external actors. So my point here, therefore, is that the problems are expanding, the alliances are expanding, but we need more coherence from the AU about how Africa is going to navigate itself around these multiple alliances. that we currently face. I don't know whether I left out any question, but we can come back to some of those issues during question time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Now I would like to invite Dr. Wekesa. And colleagues, please, if you have any questions, you're welcome to type them in the chat, but we'll soon be moving into our Q&A. Doc, as you come in, I would just like you, if you would like also to just comment on the AU leadership, especially the incoming chairpersons, because I know one of them, Prof didn't talk about him, is Raila Odinga. And we have, I mean, some people are wondering how much bandwidth he's left at 8 years old to, you know, be a big contender for that position. And then also, Prof is just from highlighting the AU coordination mechanisms. So we've been told now that we have all these mechanisms, but also we know that one of the key challenges that has been identified several times is the effectiveness of the AU and even our regional communities, regional economic communities in driving collective African agency, African priorities. So maybe just your comments, what reforms in this area would you say are necessary to enhance internal coordination before we even engage with these external players? Seeing that we all like to go when one meeting is called, the whole continent is there, but we're basically presenting the same issues. Yeah.
Certainly, thanks, Kabaso. I think my starting point will be on your last point. And a good tale will be to reflect on Africa's geopolitics in 2024, particularly from the so-called Africa Plus One summits. These are, big summits where, as Professor Kadiagala has, referenced, African leaders are invited to, and then they go there to basically be sometimes lectured, sometimes given an agenda that emanates from elsewhere. Last year, we had no less than 7 or 8 of those. And remember, the Africa Union External Partnerships Unit or Directorate, led by a diplomat from Mauritius, or I think Seychelles, is staffed by just about 2 or 3 people. So these, as Africans started off in Kampala with the G77 and the non-aligned movement summits. Then in about April or May, there was the Italy-Africa Summit, followed in June by the Korea-Africa Summit. The BRICS Summit or meeting in Russia followed. Then there were 3 very quick ones in quick succession in September. Indonesia, Africa, FOCAC in Beijing, and then all these leaders and the AU Secretariat responsible for this headed out to New York for the United Nations General Assembly. And this last year's was particularly important because there was the launch, unveiling of the Pact for the Future, which speaks about the reform of global governance. And then come October, and we were into planning for the G20. So in quick succession, you see that there's a density of these summits against a very thin on the ground staff at the African Union. And as Prof. Kadiagala mentioned, and as Anita alluded, the African countries do not have external policies. They might be in their foreign policies, but not specifically, engagements with different powers, with understanding that different powers come with ideological differences, different interests. The interests of the Chinese might be slightly different or even substantially different from the Americans. And the American interests might be quite different from the BRICS more broadly. And remember, the BRICS is now expanding to include Africa, many other African countries. So I think the idea of creating an external partnership framework is very important. We've seen AUC chair, the outgoing chair, mention the need for this framework. I think if you look at the writings and his news conferences and so forth, there's been mention of this, but there's been really no movement. And I suppose the core issue here will be to use, in the context of African agency, to have an African starting point, to say what is our priorities, what are our goals with the different partners, not what are the other partners' interests to us and how do we align and fit in? Because as it is, we are being split in very many directions, so much so that we lose focus. In fact, sometimes we set aside the Agenda 2063 mantra, so that it's just some kind of clarion call that doesn't really serve as the core of our starting point in negotiating, bargaining. And in the world of realism, really it is all about bargaining from your own standpoint. So I suppose and of course, I think to relate this to the regional economic communities, regional economic communities were set up and in fact are considered as the 5 pillars of the five building blocks of the African Union or the African region, as it were. But I think, again, there are many problems with the RECs. First of all, many of the RECs or the regional economic communities have postponed many of their plans. If you talk of the East African community, for example, I've even lost count of the number of times we've pushed forward or backwards the idea of a monetary union, of a political union, of a customs union, and so forth. And this applies across both to the SADC, to ECOWAS, to ECAS, to the African Maghreb Union, and so forth. And I think this also applies to this regional economic community's engagement with global powers. If you went to the East African community in Arusha today, you'll find the Germans doing their own thing there under GIZ. You'll find the Chinese have structured their own deal. And these are not really aligned very well with the coordinating role of the AU in terms of a continental approach. In fact, there's been critique even from scholarly circles to say, how should African countries engage with global powers? Is it at the continental level, at the RECs level, or at the national level? And in fact, we see in this particular incidence, when national interests take are kind of paramount, African countries are always happy to abandon the idea of RECs or the African Union. A good example is Kenya, and it's working on a free trade area with the US during Trump 1 administration. And I think there are many examples to cite. So I think we need to, in the course of the reform and reworking of the partnership agreement, I will propose that we just recognize that there are things we can do together at the continental level through the AU. There are things we can do together as East African community or SADC because of our cultural affinities, our similarities in political systems and natural resources and so forth. And there will be things then we can do at a national level, but tied together so that there's a golden thread from the national to the continental. I think, Kabaso, you asked a very tricky question on the candidates and for the African Union chair, and you particularly mentioned Mr. Raila Odinga, who I think now I've learned from Professor Kadiagala that he might be not really the front runner anymore. Mahamoud Yusuf from Djibouti might be ahead. My sense on without necessarily personalizing this, is we need an African Union Commission chair who is a couple of things. One, he has to be a diplomat. And being a diplomat might suggest that he's able to negotiate with particularly egoistic leaders, leaders with big egos. I'm imagining if even Raila Odinga was running counter to Paul Kagame's interests, that would be a clash, particularly if Rwanda is on the wrong. And I'm not saying it is wrong, but if it were wrong in its involvement in DRC. And if you went around the continent, you will see these very big egos that require an AUC chair that is a diplomat. So my open-ended question is, will Raila Odinga be that kind of person? I think the other point is you referenced the fact that Raila Odinga is 80 years old. The AU position is a CEO position. It's chief executive officer. It is administrator. You need to know your staff. I know on this call, there are people who have managed large organizations. You need to know everybody, at least as many people, if possible, up to the lowest of levels. You need to be able to rise to the occasion of frequent crises. In fact, almost on a daily basis, there's something dramatic happening. So basically, we need an energetic person. I believe Raila has demonstrated energy, but we must appreciate that he's 80 years old. And in the circumstances, he will need a very strong, energetic, young secretariat perhaps to help with that. I think the other factor here is that the AU chair must be also someone that can negotiate with global powers. So now you have to look at the fact that the other candidate is from Djibouti. There's that Francophone, Anglophone question, although a number of African countries in the so-called, in the so-called coup belt, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, have bolted from the Francophone end of things, and many are considering that, including Senegal. But there's that question of Francophone, Anglophone considerations. On the basis of even just matters of justification, if Yusuf of Djibouti takes it, we are going to see the continuous Francophone country being at the secretariat because Mahamat was from Chad and so forth. But I think I'll stop there because I think I've rambled quite a bit. Over to you, Kabaso. Yeah.
No, I mean, thank you so much. That was very informative. And we'll get to the Q&A shortly, but before we do, just one last, well, not last question, but one of the questions I would like to pose to our speakers. And I mean, we've talked a lot about coordination, strategic partnerships, and I imagine we cannot run away from that because it's one of the key things that the AU should do. But I want to think about non-alignment and revisiting non-alignment. Some scholars have highlighted the importance of reviving Africa's historical non-aligned stance in politics. So now we've seen it's, the world is moving towards multipolarity, the shift in global order. And even as we discuss how Africa should engage strategically, do you think that Africa should rethink its positioning between all these major global powers, including, the traditional powers and the emerging powers? And in doing that, how can the AU facilitate this strategic and independent approach to external partnerships? So I'll start with Dr. Kiamba, and then we'll move to Prof, and then Doc, you can comment last, and then we'll have the Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much again, Kabaso. With regards to non-aligned movement, I don't suppose that there was any time when Africa was considered to be non-aligned, even during the Cold War. I think we usually used to take sides, but take sides strategically. We ate from both sides of one can say, from the cake. In regards to the current situation, is it a possibility that we can become non-aligned? I don't think so. Not with the current environment as it is, and not with what Bob identified as Africa being everywhere and running too thin with regards to, if it is not, Africa, Indonesia, Africa, China, Africa, India, Africa, Turkey, we are also, engaging in regional organizations, like, for instance, AU, EU, and so on. So we've run thin. And ultimately, we cannot say that we are, non-aligned anymore. I think that's basically for the history books. And even those history books would bear, notification that we were never aligned even from the beginning. It's just that we were able to shape what we were doing at that point in time without necessarily coming out front to say that, we are more aligned to the US and less to Russia and more to China and so on. We've also seen Africa beyond, focusing on Europe. We are also in Asia, as a region, Beyond that, we also have our cultural and diasporic ties, when you talk about Afro-Caribbean and Afro-Arab. So it doesn't seem that we are aligned at any given time. We also are aligned when it comes to South-South relations, when we say that, okay, we are not interested in the North anymore. Let us just collectively move towards nations that are similar to us, those that are engaged in development practices and so on. So ultimately, we are still aligned in one way or another. However, though, I think the best way that Africa needs to shape itself and become one that is a force to reckon with is to ally itself we cannot always talk about, trying to focus on various nations' foreign policy, yet it does not even clearly identify who you are relating with or engaging with, or whose foreign policy is directed towards. So again, we fail miserably when we muddle through. So I think it's a high time that we stop muddling through, identify, who we are relating with, and pursue, those goals, those objectives, those strategies with the countries that we wish to look out for. The other thing that I suppose that is important for us, even with regards to alignment, is that currently the world, yes, we are multipolar. So we need to find our place and our space. We cannot again, like history tells us, when Morgenthau was telling us that Africa is a politically empty space. We cannot continue with that, being told that, okay, we are nowhere to be seen, or even with regards to Samuel Huntington and saying that there are great civilizations, but Africa is nowhere to be seen. And if there's a civilization, it's only Egypt that carries the load for the rest of us. So it's important for us to basically move towards being aligned. And being aligned basically means that you're clearly identifying what your foreign policy direction is all about, who you are interested in relating with, rather than just coming as a blanket and saying, okay, we are interested in, the Caribbean region, or we are interested in the Arab region, without necessarily picking who exactly you are interested in. So again, in line with that, we should stop, hiding behind the curtain and saying that we are a friend to all and an enemy to none. Because being aligned basically means that we'll have many enemies along the way. But there's nothing wrong with that, because our friendship or partnerships have not gotten us anywhere in the beginning. So I think it's necessary for us to move beyond just saying that we are very aligned or non-aligned, and everyone is a friend to us, and we have partners left, right, and center, yet there's nothing we are getting out of it. We need to be very, very specific, because that's what foreign policy is all about. It's directional. Who are we directing this foreign policy towards? Remember, it's not just one way. It's supposed to be an encounter between the actors that ultimately will relate and engage with each other. So I think that would be, my ideas really at the end of the day with regards to where we need to be, whether we need to be non-aligned or aligned. I believe that we need to be aligned rather than non-aligned, because by being aligned, we know where we are heading. By being non-aligned, then it's just so broad that we don't even know what exactly we are doing, which means that also other nations come and there's no proper reflection on how we are going to begin engaging this African nation, because it is aligned to everyone else. It is a darling to everyone else, a friend to everyone, and an enemy to none. So with that, then we are able to more or less shape where we are heading, and also to have a firm basis from which we can begin identifying allies in the international system, whether they are global or regional or major powers, as the case may be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doc. Prof, I'd like to invite you to come in, and as you do, just to address one of the questions in our chat. What does it mean to be aligned, and are relations with others evidence of an aligned position?
My PhD professor used to joke that Africa was an unaligned part of the Western world, or at least most of Africa was essentially the non-aligned part of the Western world. And what that meant is that I think for most of our independence period, our alignments were with Western countries. We were dependent on Western countries for the most part, even militarily. But that has been changing over the years when Africa has begun to cultivate new relationships with countries like China and increasingly Russia. So you can argue there are some parts of Africa that are really just non-aligned parts of the Russian of the Russian zone, if we could describe it in contemporary time. So I think non-alignment is a moving concept. And Anita is correct. You cannot really be entirely non-aligned. I mean, you have to sacrifice your interest to some other powers at some point, depending on what you want to get, depending on what you want to look for or what you are looking for. But my position here is that non-alignment for Africa is a very natural position for Africa, because the way the non-aligned movement of 1965, 1966 defined non-alignment was the ability of third world countries to tactically disengage from global powers conflicts, from the conflicts that do not necessarily concern them. And that is the original meaning of non-alignment, that small powers can work together to avoid, to preempt the conflicts occasioned by global powers. And that to me still remains a very nice position to hide. I think we can say most of Africans don't want to be entangled in the conflict between the Chinese and the Americans, or the Russians and the Americans. That's a very comfortable position to be in, but we should try to. All these things we have to work towards an ideal, but there's really no clear alignment, or there is no pure non-alignment. So we have to work with our partners, with our global actors, especially those actors who have the same values as us. In fact, that was the original motive in 65. Bandung spirit was small countries working with countries that have similar values to, in fact, promote peace, stability, and so on, in the context of a world that was anarchical and all that. So we should still work towards it. And we're not going to have perfect non-alignment, but I think it's an excellent ideal that we should have, we should pursue. What was one of the questions? The question on non-alignment?
You've just addressed.
I can't read the charts.
No, that is the one that I just asked you, Prof.
Okay.
So you just, yes, so you've just answered it.
That's it. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yes. Okay. And then, Doc Wekesa, would you like to come in? And as you do, I'd like you to also address one of the questions in the chat, which is there's the question of sovereignty, the sovereignty of countries. How does this sit with the AU, which is not a supranational organization? Why should we expect too much from the AU when it doesn't self-finance? Isn't it the case that he who pays the piper calls the tune?
I think, let me start with the he who pays the piper. I think it's a good phrase to start with. And I think this is where we see who pays the piper in this case for the AU is the funders, who are external partners. I think we've been told that quite a high percentage of operations are actually funded by external partners. But now to the question of sovereignty, I think it is understood in global politics and international relations theory more broadly that, you know, countries kind of let go some level of sovereignty to a supranational organization for the sake of, you know, partnership, global governance, and so forth. This is the argument that has come through again and again in this whole debate and discussion around global governance reforms, of which the Pact for the Future outcome document from the UN General Assembly last year, you know, speaks. And I think a good example of a successful, I think there are two, you know, organizations that have done well in terms of managing national sovereignty vis-a-vis supranational sovereignty. The EU, you know, has done exceedingly well for itself, even though it had some turbulent times at the point of UK's exit, Brexit, about 10 years ago. Time flies. It's already about 10 years ago. But because the Brits were not keen to let go certain aspects of what they considered sovereignty for them, they were let go, and they are now out. But otherwise, the AU as a unit, we have Germany and France and so forth, and Belgium, that are sovereign nations, but then they are subject to more regional values, projects, collective global approaches on matters, particularly security. I think we see this coming through quite a bit on their concern with Ukraine and so forth. This is, I think, what African countries have signed up to for themselves from the Abuja Declaration in the early 80s to present. But it's one that they have failed to live to, particularly when there are big problems, as we've seen with the rise of military governments who then leave the African Union because they believe they can do well on their own. Or countries such as Zim that have major internal challenges, and when they are challenged by the AU, they claim we are a sovereign nation. This used to be Robert Mugabe's mantra a couple of years back. And so I think the idea of international organizations or IGOs, I think the other rec that I should have mentioned was ASEAN countries, the Asian, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which have actually kind of jailed quite a bit in terms of, letting go of their sovereignty on certain issues that are bigger than themselves. Where you understand that whatever you do on cross-continental infrastructure, for example, as spelled out in the presidential infrastructure development plan or agency, cross-border infrastructure you can't do alone. You have to coordinate. Peace and security, as is happening in the Sudan and DRC, is something that you need collective effort, where sovereignty might be tampered with for the good of everybody. But Kabaso, I think we are almost running out of time, as I can see. We have not even gotten to the fact that Kenya is hosting 10 leaders on Monday, on these reforms. We've not gotten to the fact that Donald Trump just took over power in Washington, D.C., and as Africans, we've been very reliant on the U.S. in matters health, like PEPFAR, President's Emergency Fund for HIV/AIDS. We have the AGOA, initiative to think of. So, and of course, even on matters like non-aligned movement, we haven't even gotten to look at how the concept and the practice has evolved over the years. We started with all this idea of Africa and other countries as third world. We moved on over the years to the idea of developing nations rather than underdeveloped nations. These are conceptual terminologies that, as scholars, we might want to unpack. There's the contestation around the whole idea of global South. And I had this quite a bit at the summit in Kampala, where some African thinkers and scholars were arguing that if we say we are non-aligned, and yet there's a concept and practice of global South that is rising. And yet in the global South formation, we have global powers. China is a global power there, or some emerging powers and so forth. But in a nutshell, I guess these are some of the issues that will have that make it very interesting to watch Africa in 2025.
Great. I mean, there's a lot to unpack. Maybe, but I would like us to address also some of the questions in the chat or the comments. And then if anyone has any more questions, you could also just react, and would give you a chance to directly speak and ask or comment. Depending on how much time, it would probably have to be very brief. Douglas Okwach, is it a problem that we have many external interests converging in Africa? Or isn't the problem that we don't know what we want from those interests, geopolitically speaking? I don't know who can take this, but let me just move to the next one as well so that they can be taken in pairs. This one is from Ueli. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Dr. Wekesa rightly observed that the exercise of African agency at state, regional, and continental requires better coordination. The AU's leadership on subsidiarity has been patriarchal at best, unfortunately. So what would be a best way forward to improve on this? So we'll take those two. Who would like to go first?
I can venture here. I think
Okay,
on the
thank you.
question of interest, Douglas's question is a question of invitation. I think external actors are in Africa because they are invited by Africans. That's the simplest way to understand it. If countries didn't need these actors, they would not be with us. They would not be here. They would be told to go back home. So I think we have to look at the problem of invitation and why the invitation occurs in the first place. Because I think there are many external actors that may not have any interest in Africa, but they're invited here, largely because we are weak. But also the argument, which is very conventional, a lot of external actors are coming here to exploit our resources. Is because we invite them because we don't have the means to exploit these resources. So that to me is the simplest way to look at the question of who are these geopolitical interests and how can we manage them, I think, more productively. On the issue of subsidiarity, I think the subsidiarity issue is the AU regs. It has always come up within the AU so-called reform process. We need better coordination between the AU and the regs. We need to have subsidiarity. We need entities that do better work to do it and not be interfered with. It is an issue that is never going to be resolved unless you re-engineer the African continental system. The AU wants to do so many things, just as the regs want to do their own thing. And I don't think if you appoint a commission to study that, you're going to get anywhere. You still just have to go back to the drawing board and say the issue of working together depends clearly on subsidiarity. That means, what do we do well that we should not allow you to come and do it? What do the regs do better than the AU? And that's the simplest way to describe it. But then ultimately, the bigger issue is that if you don't define those roles clearly, you're going to have competition. And the competition is going to come because you have not really defined who should be doing what. And again, I like the fact that our friend Bob was mentioning the DRC. The DRC in a subsidiarity stance is the work of the region, not the AU. But again, the region maybe can't do it. So they'd have to invite the AU. But if you invite the AU, what are they going to do? So it's a murky issue here. Who is better doing at what? Who has the resources? And these are issues we haven't really clearly defined. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Prof. Bob, Anita, would you like to come in anywhere?
Okay.
And as you do, also just to consider the other question, which is, where does the AU forte or strength lie when countries like Ethiopia, which houses the AU HQ, and others are members of other regional blocs like the BRICS? So where does the AU strength come from when we have such scenarios?
Okay, I think I'll take some. Thank you so much. I think I'll take part of Okwak's question and possibly Kubai's question about the interests. I think Prof has already clearly indicated that these nations are usually invited into Africa. And therefore, the idea of interest should not really arise as much. But my perception with regards to that is that there is no problem with having so many interests in Africa. The only problem here is that we need to itemize, we've got to prioritize the interests, and we've also got to know how are we going to provide feedback to those interests. Are they in our interest? when those interests are paraded around, or whose interests are they, you know? So we have to think about ourselves first with regards to, yes, others are interested in us, but are we interested in them? And if we are, how then are we going to come to that level where we can balance out the interests? The question about alignment by Okwach, I think Kubai is sorry, about, you know, how do we then get to know what alignment is? I think the question in brief was, are relations with others evidence of an aligned position? Not really, because we have, of course, what is known as international relations, and not that everyone or every nation that has got international relations is aligned to everyone else. I think one must think about what checklist can we have while identifying what is an aligned position. And there are many ways to identify some of these things. I'll just give you a few. For instance, do we have the same values, political values? If we do have, like was said earlier, then it's likely that we will be aligned with each other. One would also think about the military alliances. Those that have got military alliances or military pacts are usually aligned towards, you know, that who is giving them or providing, you know, them with that military hardware or whatever it may be. The other one would be resource allocation. If there is a nation that provides resources towards a certain end or towards a certain program, then one can say that we can comfortably think about that being more or less being aligned, and aligned to the extent that it's not just a grant, but it's millions of dollars. Yeah. So one must think about the checklist when you're talking about, you know, who is aligned to whom and for what reason, including, for instance, when Kenya decided to ally with NATO, then that basically means we are allying, you know, with excuse me, we are allying with members in NATO, or the position they do have. So again, there are many ways to figure out what an alliance looks like, or what, if you are aligned to certain nations or a nation, what you'll be looking out for. Now, maybe just to think about the last question by Duncan, where does the AU forte strength lies when countries like Ethiopia, that has got, of course, the headquarters, and others are members of other regional blocs? I wouldn't call BRICS a regional bloc as such, but rather it is a way through which nations have decided that this is how we are going to balance the rest of the world. We do not want them crowding us out with their international financial institutions. We are not interested in the way they talk down to us in terms of politics and so on. So it's more or less a movement of nations that are cooperating to a certain extent, but they've not really gone beyond having some political union or economic union from which they can benefit, you know, as a group of nations. So it is okay for Ethiopia to be wherever it is and still have, you know, the headquarters, while still being a member of BRICS, because it's more or less trying to show that they are financially independent to some extent, for instance, from the World Bank or the IMF, because we know that when it comes to BRICS, there are certain ideologies that they have been pushing. And most of those ideologies are to do with financial independence, or having a better ally when it comes to dependence of, you know, financial, to be financed on certain programs and the like. So there's nothing wrong with that. It's up to now probably the region, you know, to think or to make what of Ethiopia is doing when it comes to that, because all of us have got a choice. We all have a choice whether we can get into BRICS or not. We know where the choice of Kenya decided to, you know, we hung up our boots even before, once we were threatened, you know, by a certain nation that is everywhere, you know, when it comes to being an ally of Kenya and so on. So again, there's nothing wrong with that. I think it's more or less nations that are trying to seek their own independence in their own way. But that shouldn't really ruffle too many feathers out there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Peter. If you allow me, I'll just go ahead and read it. The idea of sovereignty certainly needs to be revisited. Already 9 conflicts are occurring in Africa. The fact that Sudan peace is being mediated in Saudi Arabia, federal states of Somalia and Ethiopia conflicts are being mediated in Turkey, is a manifestation of losing Africa's sovereignty. The other issue is the US withdrawing from WHO, the World Health Organization, knowing it's the largest funder of PEPFAR, approximately 120 billion USD in 2024. This support towards HIV and malaria is normal. How will Africa finance this? Finance it? Previously, declarations have been made, but what about their full implementation? Political goodwill has been missing. Has been a missing link. The new AUC chair must be one who can push African countries to agree to finance its own programs rather than depending on advanced economies. This is from Peter. Doc Bokesa, maybe I'll just ask you to comment on this, particularly focusing on WHO withdraw from PEPFAR because you highlighted it, but also it's something we haven't really touched on, and we've touched on other comments in that question.
Thank you, Kabaso, and thanks, Mbuva, for that question. I think what I would like to do is try to tie this to the whole question of engagement between the continent and multiple external powers. And I think that way I can cover a little more ground. The point here, I guess, is that while multiple partners with the continent is not a bad thing, it becomes a bad thing if you do not have a plan. Because I think we have an interest in external powers. We can never do everything together. There's a sense in which we are in one world. It's a global village, as the adage goes. And so we have to relate with everybody else on planet Earth. Matters climate change tell us as much. But at the same time, we have, at the same time, some of these external powers are very interested in us. We are interested in them, they're interested in us. It is almost quid pro quo. So in instances where global powers are interested in our minerals, interested in our resources, they understand Africa as the largest, as a fast growing population. Africa is a market, and many other areas in which they would want to invite themselves into our space. It's a balancing act, therefore, and good balancing acts are well framed in a framework, which is why I would imagine one of the things the new AUC chair will do is urgently come up with an external engagement framework. And I know that sometimes these policies, frameworks, and so forth are not implemented to the full. This is one of the major problems with the AU. But at least having something that is agreed upon as in existence will help us coordinate at the AU level, at the REX level, and at the national level. And I think it is something that then can be reviewed. That way, we can address issues like Mbuva is raising. When we have a president in the US who signs 50 executive orders, by the way, it's not just health. It's also, the Paris Agreement, the US has withdrawn. Africa has a deficit of about 250 USD billions. Where are we going to get that? The fact that we have multiple partners will suggest that we can start looking elsewhere. So it's not a bad thing in that sense. That on matters to do with migration, for example, with the US and following almost in the European steps to kind of stop migration of even people who have really gone out there to advance their skills and knowledge and so forth. We can start looking elsewhere. For example, India, which is very good in IT. So, tying all these pieces kind of together, we then find that if we have a framework that clearly states or charts our course in terms of engagement with one partner who has this comparative advantage vis-a-vis the other, I think that would be a good way to then engage well with the global partners. I think I'll also just throw in an academic perspective on this question. I think raised by Douglas, for example, that is it that we have many external partners coming to us, or we don't know what to do with them? I think this can very well be stated in a hypothesis. Are we looking at this as is the starting point looking at external partners coming to Africa, or us going to external partners, or something in between? I think that would be an interesting way to then look at our interests versus the interests of the external powers, and then charting what we might as well call the Africa First policy, or make Africa great again. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all the panelists. But before we go, I would just like to get maybe your final comments in under 2 minutes. And as you address these final comments, I would just like you to comment on the African Continental Free Trade Area. We've already mentioned that we had a lot to unpack and there was no time. And maybe next month in our next webinar, in which we'll be looking at Africa in 2025, we can unpack a lot of these issues. But just to close us off, and because the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is, one of, if not the biggest, I could call it mechanism or transformative initiative that the AU has. So maybe just your quick comments on how the AU can leverage this for better terms, to negotiate better terms with our various external partners. So just in under 2 minutes, as you do your closing remarks. I'll start with Anita.
Okay, thank you so much, Kabaso, once again. About the ACFTA, I think I'm split when it comes to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Why am I saying this? Because at the regional level, we still have quite a lot of work to do in our regional economic communities. So I think we may be jumping quite a number of steps, even as we try as Africans to, come up with a free trade area. Remember, we've talked about the fact that we do not even have a common passport, meaning that we may not, see this through in terms of the movement of people from place to place. The other one would be, of course, it provides us with that leverage, but to what extent? Because out there, for instance, the EU will come to specific regional regional economic communities where it deems itself best to operate within. So again, we still have a lot of work to do with regards to, ensuring that our regional economic communities are more attractive, not only to external partners, but also within the region, because ideally ACFTA is supposed to see maybe ECOWAS and the East African Community and SADC and COMESA coming together and trading amongst themselves. But that may be limited currently because of the fact that we do not have free movement of people and commodities because of the customs union. So I think we need quite a bit more to emphasize either that or collapse some of the steps, even as we try to achieve much, much more. Still within the SCFTA, I think in as much as we would like to make it attractive, I think we also need to ensure that it's, perceived as being the, what Africa really, really wants at the end of the day. We know that, of course, some regional economic communities are doing better than even if they were brought together. So I think there's need for us to go back and see how we can create a better perception about the African Continental Free Trade Area, and how we can, within the SCFTA, also provide, because ultimately, if we are talking about the fact that we are still getting finances from external partners, the only solution would be to use SCFTA with regards to the customs union and the free trade area and whatever it is that makes markets move. So we need to look internally. I think that's the only way we can begin winning ourselves out of too much foreign dependence. I think I'll leave it at that. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I agree entirely with what Anita is saying. I think we've celebrated too early on this African Continental Free Trade Area. If we read the history from what Bob was mentioning, the Abuja Treaty, in the 80s into the 90s. We know that integration has been a very, very, very slow and very gradual process. And the African Free Trade Area is just one of the latest iterations in that long struggle for integration. And we are not there yet. And so I would not put too much strength in the Continental Free Trade Area as this new agent that is going to permit us to negotiate with external world better. We need at least another 25 years to evaluate the progress of the new institution. So I would caution about a celebration around it. My last point is that I think we've been talking about reforms, and I want to go back to my initial point that reforms are important, that we should own these reforms. We should not run away from them. We should be critical about the pace of these reforms because this is good for us and for the continent. My last point is that I just saw recently that there is an African School of Governance that was established in Kigali recently. And my point is that I don't think we need any more school of governance in Africa. I think what we need now is an African School of Integration to teach us about how to run our institutions, particularly the African Union and the REX. I think we'll be making progress if we can begin to think through how to set up these important institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Doc.
Okay, Kabaso, my last word on this, just a couple of points on African Continental Free Trade Area. My thoughts are close to Anita's as well. I think we need to have a play at both the continental level, at the regional level, and national level. And I think one of the things that we could do internally is, of course, the whole story of reducing or removing trade barriers between nations, kind of focusing on export to external markets and so forth. And I think the nations, REX, can still serve as building blocks to the African Continental Free Trade Area. But the top-down view also is valid, that the African Continental Free Trade Area can infuse some sense of energy and structure and agency into percolating things down so that we can see a situation where we have goods and services from Mauritania being consumed in Johannesburg and so forth. But at the same time, we must realize that African Continental Free Trade Area is sometimes not quite the ideal vehicle from the point of view of external powers. I say this because in the Trump 1 administration, the focus was on forget about AfCFTA. We want to negotiate with countries bilaterally rather than multilaterally. And we've seen the European Partnership Agreements, the APS. Similarly, they seem to favor nation to nation, as Kenya did. Of course, Kenya, some people said Kenya was a sellout because in the other partners in the region were saying, the East African community was saying, let's bargain collectively. I think it will be remiss of me not to say that communication, which didn't come in for discussion a lot, is equally important. I think this aligns with Prof. Kadiagala's other point, is that citizens are actually not aware of AU. And in fact, you said AU to my grandmother, they will be like, what is that to start with? I think communication comes in very critically here because, and I can see my friend and colleague on the call, Churchill Otieno of the African Editors Forum. I think in the era of social media and so forth, I'm a member of the International Relations Society of Kenya WhatsApp group, which is vibrant. I wonder why the AU cannot even just leverage some of these very cheap and available and convenient platforms to mobilize the continent through communication strategies so that there's a sense of belonging, contribution of ideas and so forth. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all our speakers for today. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, my two doctors, Thank you very much. It was a very fruitful discussion, but of course it was even made more fruitful by the audience, everyone who was joining us today. Thank you for your comments and your questions. We've gone slightly over the time that we allocated ourselves, so apologies for that. But also we haven't discussed a lot of the issues that we thought we could touch in this meeting. And next month, around this time, we'll send out word again. We have another webinar that will be looking at the AU in 2025, key internal and external trends and expectations. So please do join us for that one, and we'll unpack a lot of the issues that we haven't discussed today: AGOA, the African Continental Free Trade Area itself, Trump administration, which that alone could be a full webinar on its own, and a lot more issues. And then also just to mention that the recording of this will be available afterwards. You're welcome to request it, but also we upload it on our social media, on our YouTube. And also if you need a transcript for this meeting, it will also be uploaded on our website. So you're welcome to also just get in touch bilaterally if you need any further resources regarding this webinar. Thank you so much. Okay, one more. Bob, would you like to say something, please?
No,
you can go ahead.
Just a quick last word is that
Sure.
this. I was just going to say this webinar was organized in partnership with the Department of Diplomacy and International Studies, University of Nairobi, which Anita Kiamba here represents, in partnership with University of Witwatersrand. I think this is part of integration, and the AU can learn from us. I wanted to say that, and there will be many more of this kind. Thank you. Right.
Thank you very much. And that was an oversight on my part. I apologize. Thank you so much, Anita and Prof and Doc. See you next week, rather next month. Enjoy your weekend, colleagues.